Hello and welcome to today's talk. Today I have, I should probably show myself. Sorry about that. Today I have the extreme honor and privilege and pleasure to introduce two of my most excellent colleagues in the Department of Psychology. So first, we have Dr. Desdemona Rios, who is an associate professor of social psychology and director of the Latinx and Latin American Studies program at the University of Houston, Clear Lake. She holds a joint doctorate in psychology and women's studies from the University of Michigan, and she teaches courses on personality, social psychology, and psychology of gender, race, and sexuality. She grew up in Los Angeles, California, attending community college before completing her BA in psychology at California State University, Northridge. After teaching at Bowdoin College in Maine, Dr. Rios came to the University of Houston, Clear Lake, where, being a first-generation and non-traditional college student, she works with students from similar backgrounds. Dr. Rios's teaching and research reflect a commitment to diversifying spaces of higher learning. She is the recipient of 3 national teaching awards from the American Psychological Association Society for the Teaching of Psychology, the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, and the Association for Women in Psychology. She is also the recipient of UHCL's Hayes Diversity Award for her work with underrepresented groups. She serves as consulting editor for Psychology of Women Quarterly, as secretary for the Texas Association for Chicanos in Higher Education's Gulf Coast region, and she sits on the executive council for the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues. Her current research focuses on community-based projects, including kinship adoption in the foster care system, and examining collaborative practices among nonprofits serving Houston's East End communities. We also have Dr. Amy Lucas, who is Associate Professor of Sociology and Chair of the Social and Cultural Sciences Department at the University of Houston, Clear Lake. She holds a doctorate in sociology and teaches courses in social stratification, family sociology, statistics, and research methods. She grew up in Allentown, Pennsylvania, and attended Penn State University, where she earned a BA in sociology. She went on to earn an MA and PhD in sociology at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Dr. Lucas's teaching practices and research are guided by her desire to create more inclusive and equitable communities and structures. Her research centers around 3 main foci: family sociology, social stratification, and the sociology of teaching and learning. She is the recipient of the National Society of Leadership and Success, Sigma Alpha Pi Teaching Excellence Award in 2018. She currently serves as the advisor for Alpha Kappa Delta Sociology Honor Society. Her current research is focused upon the relationship between socioeconomics and romantic relationship quality and the experiences of academic parents at a teaching-centered university. So please join me in thanking and welcoming Dr. Rios and Dr. Lucas for the presentation today.
Thank you, Dr. Scythia. So this is just an overview of what Dr. Lucas and I will be speaking about today. We're going to provide some context to the work that we do, which includes a proposal to the National Science Foundation Advanced Project. We will talk about UHCL goals for diversity, equity, and inclusion. We'll define some key terms that are involved in this work. And then we'll describe our research methods, the results of our research, and then we'll discuss what we think those results mean. Next slide, please. So before we begin, we want to acknowledge that this work is largely possible because of the earlier work conducted by our colleagues, and often during times when our community was less receptive to these ideas. We are grateful to the many generations of UHCL colleagues who have contributed to building a foundation from which we now work. Next slide.
And we also wanted to make sure to acknowledge our participants. We are incredibly grateful and thankful to them. Our faculty colleagues were incredibly generous with volunteering their time, and during a pandemic, no less. They were incredibly thoughtful and gave very thoughtful and meaningful responses to questions over Zoom, which also isn't always the easiest medium, as we know, to sometimes have discussions. And they had a real willingness to engage in meaningful discussion with one another, even when not always maybe knowing an answer or wondering if their answer was the correct one. That takes quite a bit of courage and a willingness to be vulnerable in a setting that often doesn't prize or reward academics for being so. So both Dr. Rios and I want to say that we are incredibly grateful and thank you to all of our participants. Next slide, please.
The work we'll be presenting is in line with UHCL's stated values of diversity and inclusion. And although much of the work Amy and I do is centered in or on STEM fields, we recognize there is a need for diversity, equity, and inclusion work across the university. The goals of our work include writing a proposal for an advanced grant, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a second, as well as our anti-racism work groups to address these issues university-wide. Our colloquium subcommittee is currently underway with the training for faculty, staff, and administration, and then the Equity and Ethnic Studies program. These groups will convene in the fall. Next slide. So just a quick overview of or a larger context for the work that Amy and I are doing. We have been working with some colleagues in the College of Science and Engineering, and in particular, writing an advanced grant, which is sponsored by the National Science Foundation. So the goals of the advanced program are to increase representation and advancement of women in academic science and engineering careers. And since 2001, NSF has invested over $270 million to support the advanced project. And there have been some positive and important outcomes, including the increased recruitment, but also the retention of women in these fields. But also over the decades, researchers have recognized the need for an intersectional lens because they started to notice that there were also low numbers of some ethnic and racial minority groups across these across STEM fields. Next slide.
And so before we discuss our results and findings in our study, we wanted to take a step back and examine more closely key terms that are often used in academia. So diversity, inclusion, best practices, and implementing best practices. And the reason why we wanted to take a step back is often as academics, we don't really stop and reflect upon what those terms actually mean, the definitions that individuals may be using, and having a discussion if we're all kind of on the same page in terms of how we're defining and using those terms. Next slide, please. So within academia, diversity is oftentimes used to think about in terms of demographic characteristics. So it's often, particularly within academia, referring to potentially the racial identity or composition of groups, the gender identity in the composition of groups, and the intellectual abilities and varying abilities that may exist within a group. When you hear the term diversity in academic settings, it's oftentimes paired with ideas of fairness and inclusion, but it's important to note that diversity is often relegated to counting how many are in the room, and that in and of itself does not mean that there is fairness or inclusion that is operating within a setting. Next slide, please. So Thinking particularly about diversity in academia, diversity is often seen as very important and beneficial for students. For example, there's robust and strong discussion on how students benefit from diverse environments, the power for students of seeing diverse faculty as role models, etc. But there's far less discussion and understanding about the direct benefits of diversity in academia to faculty and to administration. And oftentimes discussions that center on diversity might even suggest the opposite. So in hiring practices, for example, you'll often hear faculty and administration reference the importance of hiring the best. And these discussions often imply that expanding a hiring pool or using hiring practices that are different from the status quo will weaken applicant pools, as opposed to thinking about the strengths of widening an applicant pool, how if you have a wider pool that actually strengthens the pool of candidates, and it actually will lead to a university being able to hire the best. Next slide, please.
So inclusion is usually discussed in terms of this ideal that we espouse in our communities and groups. It is often described as a core value that we all hold, or most of us hold, that we want to include everyone in the room, in the space, in the classroom, etc. Next slide, please. Specifically in academia, we talk about meritocracy or inclusion in terms of meritocracy. So all people should be allowed to enter and succeed in academia based on meritocracy. Therefore, in theory, if you earn your spot, you will be included. Next slide, please. And often we hear these two terms used together, diversity and inclusion, but what are some of the benefits? So several decades now of research tell us that demographic diversity doesn't prevent innovation. So as Amy mentioned in a couple slides ago, how sometimes these conversations imply this tension between wanting to hire the best and then opening up the pool of candidates. But demographic diversity doesn't necessarily prevent innovation, but it also doesn't guarantee it. And so what we know from the research is that innovation does make it more likely, innovation is more likely to happen with diverse teams. And it also enlarges, changes, and improves areas of study. And research also demonstrates that there are better outcomes for undergraduate and graduate students. Next slide. But how do we ensure diverse and inclusive practices or environments? Research on best practices tell us that efforts are more likely to last if they are top down and bottom up. It also seems that addressing diversity and inclusion at the local level can make a difference more broadly. So starting at the departmental level, for example. It is also important to document how things change, or in some cases don't. And finally, it seems to really make a difference when there are visible formal leaders who publicly and materially support diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. Next slide, please.
And so diversity, equity, and inclusion are a key piece and component of UHCL's strategic plan. It is listed as one of the 8 core values. And so I have listed here what's actually in the strategic plan, just as kind of a reminder for all of us in terms of UHCL's goals and ideals with regard to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And our hope is that this work can help UHCL ensure we're enacting and achieving those ideals and those values. And so it can contribute to the broader conversations and efforts that are occurring across campus. Next slide, please. As Desi mentioned, this project is developed from the advanced team and advanced work, and that there is a large number of faculty from CSE, there's faculty from College of Education, there are administrators on that team, but we wanted to particularly highlight a core smaller team that has been meeting since the fall weekly to work on the advanced proposal, and as part of the process also developed the questions and the that guided this research. And so Dr. Lori Santiago Vasquez is an associate professor in the College of Science and Engineering, and she is the principal investigator of the advanced team. So we wanted to make sure to highlight her as well, along with Dr. Rios and me. We also wanted to make sure to acknowledge and thank UHCL's Pathways to STEM program. Through the Pathways to STEM, we received a grant that partially funded our work and was greatly appreciated and helped advance our project. Next slide, please.
And so as Amy and I and our team were developing the research, the proposal, we really thought about what questions do we want to ask? What do we need to know about our community? And so our research question is very broad. How knowledgeable are we, UHCL, about diversity, equity, and inclusion? Next slide, please. And so a quick overview of our research methods. Emails were sent university-wide asking for participation in our focus groups on diversity, equity, inclusion at UHCL. And we had wanted to include faculty, staff, and administration, but only faculty responded to the email. 8 focus groups, or 26 participants, participated, and HSH was by far overrepresented, with 50% of those participants being from HSH. Our questions were open-ended to allow participants to speak freely about the topics, and focus group interviews averaged about 80 minutes. We used a transcription software for the interviews and hired a third party to proofread, during which all identifiers were removed from the transcripts, including any references to department, to names, gender, college, how long someone had been at UHCL, etc. And then Amy and I conducted a thematic analysis on questions we wanted to focus on for this presentation, which include 5 areas of interest. Next slide, please.
And so we, and as Desi mentioned, had areas of interest that we wanted to focus on specifically for this presentation. So in particular, we are going to focus on how UHCL faculty define diversity, how UHCL faculty define inclusion, why or why not UHCL faculty think diversity matters, what UHCL faculty their views in terms of what they think best practices look like, and also faculty perceptions about UHCL's diversity, equity, inclusion efforts. Next slide, please. So to start, we asked faculty to define diversity, and on the face of it, that seems like it should be a pretty easy question to answer, right? It's a term that I think a lot of us use, we hear it a lot, but if you think about it, how often have you stopped to think about the term diversity and its specific definition? And I think if you tried to stop and think, you'd realize it's not such an easy question. This question actually ended up being one of the more difficult ones for faculty to answer. There were more pauses and ums for this question than most other questions asked. And I think it speaks to how we certainly hear and use the word often, but it's not one that gets unpacked all that frequently in meetings and discussions. So in their definitions of diversity, our faculty, colleagues, and participants really understood diversity to exist at the individual level. And they described it in terms of individual differences and uniqueness, demographic characteristics, and points of view. And in the next couple of slides, we have some quotes that illustrate very well these themes that we uncovered with the responses from the focus groups. Next slide, please. So in terms of difference and uniqueness, you can see here, and this response was very reflective of a lot of the responses we received. I see it as a recognition that the individuals are unique along socially defined categories or parameters, which can include all of, it could be really anything. We're all different and we are unique, and these diversities are defined by our society. So difference and uniqueness were pretty much universal across our respondents' answers. Next slide, please. In terms of another pretty universal response, it oftentimes referenced demographic characteristics that individuals might hold. So you can see from this quote, it says, "For me, it's about the presence of people from the full range of ages, genders, national origins, sexuality, sexual expressions, religions. I don't even know which ones I've named and which I've forgotten. Geographies, right? Races, ethnicities, and diversity on its own to me just means the presence of people from those ranges and of intersecting identities within those ranges." Next slide, please. And finally, what also came up very, very frequently was references to differing points of view when you think about diversity. And this quote speaks to that very well. So it's an acknowledgement or consideration that individuals are going to have different experiences and different backgrounds, and that's going to inform their perspectives. Next slide, please.
We also asked our participants to define inclusion. And some of our participants understood this at the individual level, whereas others described it at the group or system level. At the individual level, it was often tied to teaching and tied to or related to deficits. So trying to respect where people are and getting them up to speed, so to speak. At the group level or system level, our participants described that inclusion should be very intentional and applied, and that in order to do it right, quote unquote, it does require a certain amount of self-awareness. Next slide, please. And so at the individual level, here's an example of what it looks like, how our participants described including different cultural viewpoints in the classroom. So students have different cultures. When I teach, if I only bring in examples only related to the US, I think I'm not doing inclusion. I try to find out which country they come from and then kind of bring out those things in the class. If you can hit return or enter to show the next quote, please, one more time. So meeting people where they're at. This quote exemplifies that theme. And we can do that by being open-minded, fair-minded. Also, it involves adaptability, perhaps, and flexibility, and trying to meet students or individuals or groups of people where they are and honoring that. Next slide, please. At the group level, our participants described an intentionality to inclusion that it should be implied. For example, inclusion to me is a very active term. It's an actual effort to acknowledge and incorporate those different experiences and perspectives into some sort of application. Hit enter a couple of times to reveal. Thank you. And our participants also talked about the need for self-awareness in this intentionality. For example, in order to be inclusive, you have to understand what your expectations are, what your norms are, how you interpret behavior of other people. If you don't understand where your own thoughts are, your own beliefs, your own norms, it's going to make it very difficult for you to include others. And so there is this understanding here of relationality, relationships between people. Next slide, please.
When discussing why diversity matters, faculty were universal in that it matters and it's important, and there was absolutely no hesitation in that response. It was very immediate. Words like essential, crucial, and imperative were used frequently. Diversity was seen as particularly important in terms of how it can enrich a learning environment. And again, there are a lot of responses here that also referenced perspective and point of view, and here really highlighted how there's a need for those. Next slide, please. So when terms like essential and crucial came up very frequently, and these sentiments were pretty unanimous. So I'm going to give an example of a quote here. I would go further to say it's absolutely essential in what we do. I don't know how you can have a contemporary higher education without discussing these things. So these sentiments were unanimous. It was viewed as incredibly important. But it was harder for faculty to give more concrete examples for why diversity is essential and how to behaviorally actually enact these sentiments. So the quotes oftentimes spoke in a more generalized term in terms of why it matters. Next slide, please. It was also for many faculty very important to highlight the importance of diversity within the learning framework within a learning environment. And so this quote says, I always found that diversity enriched the environment and made it better than it would have been if everyone had been exactly the same. And that's what I tell my students when I put them in groups to do work. I tell them each of you has unique talents to bring to this, so depend on them. And together you'll create something much better than what you would have done by yourself. So when faculty were answering this question, they often did so through the lens of the classroom and in their role as a teacher. Answers tended to focus heavily on the benefits for students and the benefits for the professor within the classroom, but there was very little, if any, discussion about why diversity matters for faculty, staff, and administration outside of interactions with students. There also wasn't much, if any, discussion about why diversity matters with regard to research and the research that we do. Next slide, please. Again, there was a highlight here about the importance of multiple perspectives and points of view and how that's incredibly important. A lot of these answers, again, also centered on the classroom. I also think on a practical term to emphasize the point of education is to help people reach their own potential and also help them to interact with their world in a way that is better for all of us. Right. And if we don't value diversity and we don't understand a path to equity, then we can't expect our students to do the same because it's our job to get there with them. And if we don't get them there and we don't provide the opportunities for them to get there, then they're going into the world and not, in fact, achieving what their education was supposed to help them achieve. Next slide, please.
We also asked our participants to define best practices, and there was a lot of discussion about what not to do, but some of the themes that came up around best practices include that diversity, equity, inclusion should be a shared core value, the need for a shift in culture, safety, and education. Next slide, please. So there was some concern expressed about how to make diversity, equity, and inclusion a part of UHCL community, our community at large, a shared core value. For example, I feel like the people that would sign up for that, so they were referring to training, I feel like the people that would sign up for that would be folks like us who are in this focus group. So incorporating it into, the department or the college-wide, what is it, like open house or something along those lines, or like faculty assembly, something like that, where you like catch people while they're there. But it almost seems like the mandatory trainings that we used to have, similar to the Title IX trainings, you can tell right away who didn't want to be there, who was mandated to be there. You could tell that they weren't present, and making it as part of something else that's required would help with that. But I would hope that maybe it would. Next slide, please. Faculty also expressed the need for a shift in culture. For example, I feel like there needs to be some major culture shifts, some major work, like down and dirty major work in the culture. I also think there needs to be structures of support. We can recruit, and like the complexion, if we're just going to take that one thing, the complexion can shift. But that doesn't mean that the support is there, or that everyone has that sense of belonging and safety and understanding that if my professor doesn't look like me, there's still an avid support for me right there. So for me, it's support structures that promotes understanding across diversity. Next slide, please. And our participants also talked about safety, and they talked about safety for the majority and also for folks in the numerical minority. So for example, for folks in the majority, one participant said, I think it's something that has to be talked about, and it has to be talked about in an environment where people will feel comfortable. It is scary. It's intimidating to think about because we all have these little implicit biases. So someone is concerned that they're going to say something which would be labeled as racist or, etc., because we do have those feelings. Can you hit enter for the next? Thank you. And then for other participants talked about the need for safety as I would just emphasize again, it goes back to feeling safe. And I don't mean safe in the sense that we shouldn't be having a discussion and challenge yourself, but creating a sense of where we are, no matter what our viewpoint, we will be listened to and respected. Next slide. Thank you. And our colleagues also talked about the need for education. So for example, I think that we need to put money into training people. Training needs to be required. It's not like a fun activity where you go and you get like your free cookie or, it has to be treated with, it should be considered professional development across the board for everyone. Next slide, please.
And so one of the last questions we asked our focus groups were our faculty participants' perceptions about UHCL's diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. When asked about previous efforts on campus, faculty were quick to point out work that had been done by faculty, that they had seen faculty program. Two programs and offices in particular were also mentioned pretty frequently. The Office of Student Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, but faculty were quick to note that this programming was geared towards students and not to faculty or staff. Not to say that faculty and staff can't participate, but the office is, as evidenced by its title, is really designed for students. The Common Reader program was also mentioned as a space in which conversations are being generated across campus with regard also to diversity, equity, and inclusion. There is a pretty strong sentiment that efforts have often happened on campus due to the labor and work of faculty and programs desire to see such programming on campus, and that it often might occur without what individuals considered high levels of tangible support, financial or otherwise, at higher levels of the institution. There was a sense among some faculty that work has often been overlooked and not valued in the areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So words like superficial were used, and a feeling like work wasn't valued at the top. It is important to note that for faculty who have been here for longer periods of time, they noted that they felt progress had occurred in recent years as compared to under previous leadership, but still felt that there was more work to be done. Next slide, please. So this also ties in this quote in terms of thinking about efforts being superficial. It ties into some of the quotes that Desi mentioned under best practices, where again here there's a sense about a concern about how to make diversity, equity, inclusion part of our UHCL community's shared core values. So this quote says, "I would say very superficial and like just skimming the surface. Especially, I think the further away you get from the classroom, as you get the bigger and bigger event, the even more and less substance there is to the matter." Next slide, please. So faculty, particularly faculty who have been here for longer periods of time, did highlight progress. So I'll go back and say a big difference from many years ago to where we are today. I think the needle has moved ever so slightly, but it is moving. It's going to take time, but we've had time and it's not moving as fast as it used to. And then the next slide, please. And then there also was a feeling from faculty of not necessarily feeling valued at the top. So this quote encapsulates well some of those sentiments that came across. "I don't feel like the university cares. I really don't. I feel like I've the service about diversity and inclusion since I got here. I've hardly seen anything change that didn't start from below." Then in addition, this new group of administration, when they talk about diversity and inclusion, they talk about all of these new things that they're doing. And that's so demoralizing to me, knowing that I and many of my colleagues have worked so hard for many, many years to do that sort of work here. Next slide, please. So in terms of our findings and kind of summarizing and wrapping up our findings, we found that discussions of diversity and inclusion tended to focus very much at the individual level. And it also centered very much on thinking about kind of faculty relationship with students and with students. If you could hit enter for me, please. And so there was less knowledge, understanding, and discussion of how these issues tie into systems and structures, and particularly when thinking about systemic inequality. So if you could hit enter again for me, please. There was also, oh, if you could hit enter one more time, please. Thank you. There is also very strong awareness that this work is crucial and essential, but there was a lack of necessarily being able to kind of explain in more specific terms how it is crucial and essential. And so that was important for us because as scholars, we don't receive the training and knowledge necessarily that we need. This can speak to a lack of knowledge because if you think about it, I think very few of us receive this type of training in graduate programs, has received this training as part of professional development, unless you yourself seek out that development. This discussion also revealed important implicit biases for us, if you could hit enter again, for us to reflect upon and consider. Diversity in many answers was tied oftentimes to a feeling of otherness. And rather than being viewed as how to achieve excellence, language often equated diversity more often with deficits or weaknesses. There was much more of a sense of needing to meet others where they are, implying that diverse spaces will be ones that are lacking in knowledge and expertise. Instead of suggesting that a diverse strength or a diverse space is one in which there is a lot of strength and knowledge that is there. And if you could hit enter one more time and another time for me. Thank you. There also our work revealed that there was definitely a disconnect felt between administration and faculty efforts, particularly when faculty were asked about their perceptions of DEI efforts and with regard to best practices. And so this suggests the need for a culture shift at UHCL and the need to work on trust and building trust across administration and faculty for DEI efforts to succeed and to become more systemic within the university system and structure. Next slide.
Future directions in our work includes using these data to identify UHCL, the needs of UHCL. Which will then inform the advanced grant, which is intended to develop learning opportunities based on our community's needs. Our preliminary findings suggest that we first need to ensure that we're all on the same page with a uniform understanding of key terms and also why diversity matters. This also includes understanding the benefits of diversity, equity, inclusion, and our findings suggest that our community would benefit from more conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion at the systemic level, as well as best practices among faculty, staff, and administration. We want to thank you again. We want to thank our participants again for taking the time, sharing their knowledge with us to allow us to put this together, to examine more closely who we are as a community. And we also want to thank again our predecessors for doing all of your work to get us to the place we are now. Thank you. That's the end of our presentation.
Thank you both so much. This was really illuminating and needful work, not just for the institution of UHCL, but also across the nation. So very briefly, I just want to point out a couple of things that you were talking about that not only you bring up, but also the participants brought up that really relates to some of the issues that we tackle head on in the field of cultural rhetorics, right? So cultural rhetorics being a field where the first thing to acknowledge is that knowledge is culturally and socially constructed, right? So what we see always as what it is that needs to get done or what is the problem, always having to question whose perspective we are centering, right? And one of the things that I really noticed as you all were talking through the interviews with folks is that people seem to really notice that teaching, or the text that we choose in teaching itself, they are always recognized as culturally situated, and even the knowledge bases that our students bring with them to the classroom are seen as such. But, you know, as instructors and just as people in general, we often overlook the social and constructed quality of knowing itself. So there's a little critique of the epistemological structures that we're using when we're trying to decide like why something matters, right? And so it kind of posits knowing as neutral, and neutrality is always centering the privileged party, right? And this always happens on a concrete material interpersonal level, requiring a reorientation. And so it struck me really pointedly when one of the interviewees said, you know, we have to start at the bottom. So one of the things that I guess I would want to ask is, having interviewed so many of our colleagues on campus, we know that so much is happening, and it's happening from the bottom up. What do you think what might it take to reorient not just those ideas coming from the bottom up, but also, you know, allowing some of that power to be shared with the folks at the bottom, so that we can make change that people have been trying to make for so long? You know, is there something that people were talking about in terms of the relationships between colleagues, students, and administrators that spoke to this?
I think you said a lot.
Sorry.
And yeah, I'm trying to like narrow down the question about power and how to share that. You said a lot. Can you maybe rephrase the question?
Right. And so one of the things that folks have been saying is that, you know, a lot of people have been doing this work, right? But it often feels like it's being shut down. And so one of the issues, right, that you rightly point out is that people are doing this work, but then people feel like they're being kind of quashed, right? Or, you know, administration might have other agendas and just kind of take over that or something. What do you think about like what people think in terms of how to reorient that, right? So that the people who are actually being affected by these issues the most on campus could have the most say? Did people have anything to say about that?
Trying to remember, I don't think we asked specifically about that. Amy, do you recall anything in the interviews where we?
Well, not specifically about that, but we did ask faculty with regard to who they thought were best qualified to lead these type of initiatives on campus. And so from the faculty perspective, there was a sense that, one, there's faculty expertise on campus that should be highlighted and valued. There was also a strong sense that deans in particular were mentioned as being very important, because if a dean values and highlights the importance of DEI work, that was mentioned, how that's seen as an important signal to the faculty beneath the dean. And also thinking about some faculty mentioned the importance of annual reviews or annual reports, where if you know that this is something valued by your dean, then that's something that you know would be meaningful to include as part of your professional development or training. There was a sense also the importance that came up very much was making sure to hire experts, whether they be internal or external in this field, and a strong sense from faculty with regard to wanting, I think, just more opportunities for training and professional development on campus was a strong answer that came through.
And something else important to keep in mind, and this is from the research, several decades now, at least two, from programs and or institutions who have had some success. One of the key indicators of that success or predictors of the success has been that it has to come from both the top and the bottom and in collaboration. So it can't just be sort of someone deciding to share power, but rather the efforts have to be in collaboration, because I think we all have a different role to play in this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's really interesting, especially because we often think that it's going to be one or the other. So that's really, really interesting. And then the other thing that I really liked that you brought up is that we all have really great ideas, but in the end, what it's going to entail is institutional and communal support, right? You know, backing that up, whether it is financial or you know, with training and stuff like that, because it seems like otherwise the onus for change is really being put on the individual, kind of like the meritocracy, right? But like the diversity version. And so I just want to say thank you for pointing that out, because I think sometimes as academics, we get lost and we think that it's really just about the ideas, and the concrete part is the part that's missing. Excellent. So there are two questions from the chat. And it says, how is UHCL like or unlike similar minority serving institutions in the general knowledge and commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion?
I think Amy mentioned this earlier. At the faculty level, so I think in terms of the programming that we try to do for students, I think there is a real commitment there, and the way that we think about this is often how we will teach students to do this. But as Amy mentioned, most of us don't have we don't get this training in grad school, and yet we're expected in the professoriate to know how to do this. Mm-hmm. And then we don't have, you know, professional development that is provided by our institutions to help us develop or to continue to grow in these areas. So I do want to say that, and I think that it is in these conversations, you know, we're starting to realize that we are expected to know this stuff without having any formal training. And so we're hoping that that realization can start to open up the conversation. Now, in terms of how we compare with other minority serving institutions, let me take a look at that question again. In general knowledge and commitment. So I think in terms of general knowledge, it's about the same across academia, save for a few institutions that have really committed, such as those who have, you know, been awarded the advanced grant. But Amy, do you know how we compare in terms of commitment?
That's a great question. That's one that we haven't specifically looked at yet. I can say there was a sense among faculty that in terms of sustained commitment in terms of programming, faculty perception seemed to be that we might be lacking or behind what other universities are doing. But that's something specifically that we haven't fully examined in a kind of scientific or methodological way to be able to fully answer that question. But that's a great question, and an important piece in terms of thinking about the work we're doing and moving forward is not just within UHCL, but then the ways in which UHCL may look compared to other institutions.
I also want to say something that's important, though, to point out that a motivator for the focus groups was really to get a sense of who we are and where we are and where we need to start, versus anecdotally comparing ourselves to other institutions. Yeah. We need to really get a sense of what are the issues here before we jump to a solution, right? Before we jump to problem solving, we really need to understand what the issues are, but also where our strengths are here too.
Excellent. And so I know that the presentation kind of touched on this, but just to kind of reiterate maybe a little. Another question asks, why did focus groups not include student, staff, and administrators?
So would you like me to go first for that? Okay. So these focus groups in particular were focused on thinking about thinking from kind of the side of those who are employed within the university. And so we were not focused on students in this particular research project. We did want to have faculty, staff, and administrators participate, and we sent out recruitment emails to all groups. Only faculty responded though, and that's why there are only faculty members in our work. So that was solely due basically to lack of a willingness of others in other roles to sign up. I do think that focus groups with students in terms of, again, if we really truly want to get a sense of UHCL and where UHCL is, and within a community, that focus groups with students would also be very important to conduct. That would be for slightly different research questions than Dr. Rios and I are examining here, but that's not at all to say that that would not be important and valuable, because it very much would be.
Great. So another anonymous question asks, I'm an alum, how can I be part of the conversation?
We have a lot going on. We have an anti-racism group that has imagined a multi-prong approach to these issues, because we can't just really tackle it from, one vantage point. And so we did recommend to President Blake a colloquium series that would include university, faculty, staff, administration, but also students and the larger community in a conversation. So we are just getting started right now, but there will be opportunity there. And I'm trying to think other areas where community members may fit. Amy and Christina, you're part of that group too, so.
Definitely the colloquium series where expertise is definitely viewed as a shared thing, where it's not just academic knowledge, but communal knowledge as well. And so we're hoping that those will also, of course, be open to members of the community to participate, not just as attendees, but as members of the community, being part of the committee, deciding what are some of the things that we need to discuss on campus and some of the people that we hope to invite.
And we would love to hear from you. So you can email any of us. We'd love your input as we develop these initiatives.
Great. So we have about 5 minutes, right? So one last question is, will some form of or type of diversity training be a required class for all degree and non-degree seekers? And if so, when might that happen? And might there be multi-levels, like one for the core and then maybe one for graduate portion?
So in the fall, we are going to be convening in a group to think about a degree granting equity and ethnic studies program. And there we will flesh out what that might look like and how UHCL can offer something that is not currently available in the Houston area. So that we'll start thinking about that in the fall. That's a great question, or a great question. But that will take some time to develop. And all of these initiatives, I think it's important, Amy and I also wanted to really mention our colleagues who've been doing this work for a long time. And so this change takes time, and it also takes volunteers to come and do the grind work with
And
us.
I will say with the question about if anything were to be required, that would obviously be a conversation that would, and a decision that would be made kind of well above the kind of pay grade of the faculty on this research project. So there's a whole process and conversation that would occur on campus with regard to that. And I think it's important, that's a great question to ask, and that would be a much larger conversation that would entail a lot of different entities on campus, presumably students, faculty senate, thinking about academic affairs and upper levels. But that's a great question to ask, to think about as future conversations that could develop and occur on campus.
Yeah.
Excellent. So we are about out of time. So please join me in thanking Drs. Rios and Lucas, not only for the presentation, but also the tireless work that they have been doing in conducting these interviews and putting together the results of the survey. So thank you so much for being with us here tonight. And I'm going to ask that if anybody would like to, you can also wait. I was hoping to do the little clappy thing, but thank you so much, and I hope that you have a wonderful evening.
Oh, before go, there's a slide that's going to be coming up so that we can preview the next talk and the HSH series. And so the next presentation is going to be March 1st at 6 p.m. And it is going to be called What Employers Want, Writing in UHCL's Top 4 Majors. And the speaker is going to be Dr. Lori Jacobs, who's an assistant professor of writing, and it will be moderated by Dr. Angela Kelling, who's an assistant professor of psychology. And we very much hope to see all of you at that next presentation too, in the College of HSH Presents.